Joe Biden's first military action as President of the United States was to bomb Syria, cementing himself as another warmonger in the Oval Office. The claim that these strikes were defensive in nature is an absurdity coming from an occupying force, which most seem to gloss over. This was a violation of Syria's sovereignty and territory and another act of imperialist aggression. So let's break this down. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communiqué. On February 25th, 2021, the United States bombed the Syrian Arab Republic. The airstrikes took place on the border between Iraq and Syria, around Abu Kamal, located in the Deir Ezzor province in eastern Syria. According to the Syrian Arab news agency, 4 were wounded and 1 person was martyred. Shortly after the attack, the Pentagon released a statement saying, quote, "At President Biden's direction, U.S. military forces earlier this evening conducted airstrikes against infrastructure utilized by Iranian-backed militant groups in eastern Syria. These strikes were authorized in response to recent attacks against American and coalition personnel in Iraq and to ongoing threats to those personnel. Specifically, the strikes destroyed multiple facilities located at a border control point used by a number of Iranian-backed militant groups," unquote. So this statement claims that these strikes were defensive, which is an absurdity in of itself. Syria has not bombed the United States or declared war on the United States. Syria is on the other side of the planet. The United States has no business being in Syria. Moreover, the claim that they were meant for de-escalation simply does not compute. Bombing another country is tantamount to a declaration of war, not de-escalation. China, Venezuela, Iran all condemned the attack, and Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova strongly condemned the bombing and called for unconditional respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria, which should not be used to settle geopolitical scores. So according to the Biden administration, this attack on Syria was a response by the United States to recent attacks on its personnel. Now, it's widely assumed by the media that what they're referring to is a rocket attack that took place on February 15th in Erbil in Iraq, where an American contractor was killed. 6 others were wounded, including an American soldier. And in another instance on February 22nd, when a rocket landed inside the Green Zone in Baghdad. This is where the U.S. Embassy is located, the biggest embassy in the world, almost the size of Vatican City, which looks more like a military installation than anything else. So while the United States claims it's defending itself and responding to rocket attacks, it conveniently leaves out the obvious that the United States is in Iraq illegally. It illegally invaded Iraq in 2003, along with Britain. The US-led coalition has no right to be in Iraq in the first place, nor in Syria for that matter. So you can't talk about defending yourself when you are the aggressor, when you are the oppressor, when you are illegally on someone else's land. You're not defending yourself when you're on someone else's land, you are attacking. Moreover, the United States has imposed crippling sanctions on Iran, which are indeed a form of siege warfare. It assassinated General Soleimani. It has violated Iran's sovereignty numerous times. But the US is not officially at war with Iran, so why is it bombing Iranian-backed militias? Is that supposed to make it okay? When the US talks of Iranian-backed militias, what they really mean are the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMU, or in Arabic, the Hashd al-Sha'bi. These are not Iranian troops. They're a popular resistance movement made up of various local ethnic religious groups, which include Shia, Sunni, Christians, Druze, who have fought very hard to defeat Daesh and to resist occupation. But of course, the United States can't speak of them as a popular resistance because then people would rightfully wonder, what are they resisting? And this would expose the United States and their allies as illegal occupiers, as an invading force which has no right to be there in the first place. As long as a Pentagon official or a stenographer for the White House says Iran or Iranian-backed militias, that's all it takes for everyone's brains to suddenly shut down and just accept that Joe Biden is bombing another sovereign nation. First of all, whether Iran has troops or militias, as they say in Syria, or the other way around, this is a matter between Iran and Syria. The United States has no right to interfere in the internal politics, alliances, partnerships, and cooperations between those two countries. Would the United States accept it if, for example, Syria bombed Korea for having an American base there? Of course not. So this is not a valid argument. Syria is a sovereign nation, Iran is a sovereign nation, Iraq is a sovereign nation. But of course, this is of no concern to the Americans and British who have colonized the region for centuries, plundering and stealing resources and meddling in the region's political affairs. Donald Trump assassinated General Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's Quds force, along with Abu Mahdi, a senior commander of the Hashd al-Sha'bi, the PMU. Now, Joe Biden bombs the PMU inside Syria. Both these actions only serve to help Daesh. And this wouldn't be the first time, of course, that the United States and its military actions, whether purposely or not, end up helping Daesh seeking to take over Syria and Iraq. In 2016, U.S. warplanes killed 62 Syrian troops in an airstrike and wounded more than 100. These troops were directly involved in the fight against Daesh. Again, in 2018, the U.S. bombed Syrian and Russian troops inside Syria, which only serves to help the foreign-backed terrorists, which they were fighting in the first place. But on top of that, they're not only benefiting Daesh with these actions, Israel is at the very least very sure to be happy about Biden's decision to bomb Syria. After all, for years, Israel has been routinely bombing Syria almost on a weekly basis, taking advantage of the fact that Syria is crippled by war and sanctions. And usually Israel almost never admits to the illegal assassinations or bombings that it carries out on other nations and governments. But Israeli officials have previously confirmed that they have carried out hundreds, if not over 1,000 airstrikes on Syria in the last decade alone. And seeing how close Israel and the United States are in their shared interests, it's not surprising, of course, that Joe Biden uses the exact same pretext. Joining me now to talk more about Biden's airstrikes on Syria is Max Abrams, Associate Professor of Political Science at Northeastern University and Fellow at the Quincy Institute. Thanks for taking the time, Professor. Appreciate having you on.
Happy to be on your show.
So, Professor, in 2018, Donald Trump bombed Syria over the alleged chemical gas attacks in Douma. Now, the OPCW scandal, that's an entire story in of itself, but I want to focus on the contrast in reaction here. At the time, Democrats like AOC and Kamala Harris rebuked Trump, citing the illegality of the strikes, yet now they're mostly silent on Biden. So there's a bit of a double standard going on here in the reaction from the media and Democrats. Would you agree with that assessment?
I see what you're saying, and I could definitely go that route. I have seen what you're describing, which is apparent hypocrisy by Kamala Harris talking about the illegality, Syrian sovereignty, and now she's the vice president, and there's doesn't seem to be any respect for Syrian sovereignty. That said, I see more continuity than differences because although Trump, was very reviled in the American public, especially in the media, one of the very few things he ever did in his whole life that was celebrated in the aggregate was attacking Syria. You'll remember that Fareed Zakaria said after he authorized the strike, congratulations, Donald Trump, it's like your first day as president. You've finally become a real president. And so if you want to be popular, regardless of whether you're on the American political left or right, with the exception of the fringes, but sort of mainstream left, mainstream right, yeah, attack Iran, attack Syria, and people will quibble, but in general, there is political value for that decision making.
Speaking of continuity, Donald Trump assassinated General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds force, and Abu Mahdi, senior commander in the PMU, which were hit just now in the airstrike by Biden. Would you say there's continuity in that and their general policy towards Iran? And who stands to benefit the most here exactly? Because, whether the United States calls them Iranian backed militias or not, the PMU have still contributed enormously in the fight against Daesh, against ISIS. So who's benefiting the most from what just took place exactly?
You're quite right that when Trump authorized the killing of Soleimani, that was depicted as controversial in the United States, and he was criticized by Democrats. Whereas clearly under Biden, we are seeing a continuity of targeted killing. And so there is hypocrisy there. With respect to who benefits, I think that one of the beneficiaries is Israel. I think that Israel, its greatest threat, according to Israeli officials, is this, it's described as a land bridge from Tehran to Beirut, particularly this axis, the Iranian government and the Iranian militia groups, all the way into the Levant. So I think that Israel recognizes that the Biden administration is not as categorically, reflexively pro-Israel as the Biden administration was. Now, don't get me wrong. I still expect the Biden administration to be very pro-Israel, but not to the same degree as Trump was. You know, they name towns and things after Trump. I'm not sure they're going to do that with Biden. So a lot of people, the conventional wisdom in the American media was that Biden was sending a signal to Iran. I actually think that the signal was to Israel more, saying we're not going to tolerate this kind of land bridge. And even though there was this delay from Biden contacting Netanyahu, don't worry, the Biden administration is going to look out for Israel just as Trump did. I think that probably the attack doesn't really surprise Iran all that much, and probably doesn't fundamentally affect U.S.-Iranian relations. I think that it's not a significant, in the history books, this will not be registered as an event in terms of that important bilateral relationship. I do think that the media has done a very bad job, an intentionally bad job, in describing the relationship between Iran and ISIS. The American media likes to downplay the fact that Iran has been not only at odds with ISIS, but one of ISIS's primary enemies, especially on the ground. And that was true both in Iraq as well as in Syria. There's an inverse relationship between them and ISIS. And so there is a concern that if Iran were continue to be attrited, as well as Russia, which has also been deeply maligned, of course, in the American media in all sorts of ways, but especially with respect to its relationship to Salafi jihadists, that could create the kind of space for ISIS and Al-Qaeda and affiliated jihadists to grow.
Yeah, indeed. And you know, one thing I'm not seeing talked a lot about in the media is how this is going to affect the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. What do you think will happen there, specifically when the Biden administration says they're open to more talks with European partners, although Iran says it wants sanctions lifted first? Do you think these strikes are going to affect the Iran nuclear deal and diplomatic endeavors in any way?
As you and your guests very well know, under Biden, the Obama administration really helped to broker the Iran nuclear deal. And so when Trump effectively destroyed it, and then Biden would get elected, one would think that, particularly because the nuclear deal was cast as Obama and Biden's one of their biggest, most important foreign policy legacies, you would expect them to just continue forward and to do whatever it takes to jumpstart this deal, which they were highly critical of Trump for derailing. But they haven't done that, actually. They've added all these additional hoops. Who's going to go first? Is there going to be relief? Is the nuclear deal going to be fundamentally changed? Are they going to add provisions to it? Are they going to include more features, like with respect to rockets and support for militant groups? All of this kind of talk increases the odds that the nuclear deal will not be recommenced. And so it is a little bit surprising how tepid they are in pushing this negotiation forward. So there seems to be a lack of clarity and a lack of bravery from this administration. And I think that we see that in the Iran nuclear deal.
How about Democrats actually doing anything to limit the scope of the AUMF? Do you see anything happening there? Supposedly since they control the House and the Senate barely. I know I kind of already know the answer, but go ahead.
It'll be interesting to see how much this administration can moderate sort of its inclination, which is to get increasingly involved in the region at a time when the American public is turning away. I think that the administration is simply going to reframe and recast some of the same behaviors, but in different terms. So we see a continuation of the use of American military force and intervention, but there's a real emphasis by the Biden team to say that it's defensive in nature. We've seen this with the weapons going to Yemen. They are defensive. We see the U.S. Attacking supposedly Iranian targets on the Syrian border, and it's defensive. So I think that there's a real sort of PR effort to present the United States as good guys, even if the U.S. will continue to liberally use military force, including probably to promote its freedom agenda, which it knows has taken on a negative connotation. And so perhaps that won't be as much of an emphasis as, for example, under the George W. Bush administration, when neoconservatives would just exclaim very loudly that our goal is to promote democracy throughout the region.
Max Abrams, thanks so much for your valuable insight. It's really a pleasure speaking with you and having you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to come on anytime.
We'll be right back after this short break. At the end of the day, we really get to see once again how Biden and his policies are just a continuation of the same old. As a matter of fact, they're almost indistinguishable from those of his predecessor, Donald Trump. Donald Trump puts sanctions on Syria, Biden keeps them. Donald Trump steals Syria's oil, Biden also steals Syria's oil. Trump builds illegal bases in Syria, Biden keeps them and builds more illegal bases in Syria. Trump bombed Syria in 2018, Biden also bombed Syria in 2021. That's not the lesser of two evils, that's precisely the same evil continued. When Trump imposed the Caesar Act sanctions on Syria in June 2020, we all knew that civilians would be hurt the most, that people would starve in a country already ravaged by a decade of war. Joe Biden, who people call the lesser of two evils, was he going to reverse this? Of course not. Secretary of State Blinken, who's his foreign policy advisor at the time during the campaign, told the Washington Post that Biden thought the sanctions were a very important tool. These sanctions have crushed the lira, the Syrian pound. Syrians are forming bread lines in a country that once used to be self-sufficient and a net exporter of wheat. Within days of Biden taking office, we saw a convoy of U.S. trucks illegally cross over from Iraq into Syria through the El Walid border crossing, as they always do, on their way to steal more oil. The Syrian permanent representative to the United Nations, Bashar al-Jafari, warned Joe Biden, quote, "The new U.S. administration must stop acts of aggression and occupation, plundering the wealth of my country, withdraw its occupying forces from it, and stop supporting separatist militias, illegal entities, and attempts to threaten Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity." Of course, Joe Biden has done no such thing. And despite a statement by the Pentagon that their priority isn't the oil, Biden still has U.S. troops building bases in Syria illegally, occupying Syria's oil fields illegally. And just like Trump bombed Syria, now we see Biden bombing Syria, although not over chemical weapons, but another one of the media's favorite boogeymen, the so-called Iranian backed militias. You know, at least in 2018, Kamala Harris, who's now the vice president, rebuked Trump, saying she's deeply concerned about the legal rationale of the strikes. Really? She's concerned about the legal rationale of such strikes? That's wonderful. I really hope she maintains that same attitude towards Joe Biden, although I highly doubt she will. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called Trump a mad king who decided to, quote, bomb a nation without the constitutional requirement of congressional approval. And yet, unlike 2018, suspiciously, AOC is nowhere to be found right now. She's been completely silent on Joe Biden's airstrikes on Syria. Not just her, but almost every single progressive member of Congress, the so-called squad, has said nothing, with the exception of Ilhan Omar. She correctly pointed out how outrageous the AUMF is because of the sweeping powers that it gives the president. Fundamentally, we still don't see any mention of actual consequences. Where's the plan to get rid of the AUMF? Where are the consequences for Joe Biden's actions in violating his oath of office and bombing a sovereign nation? We're not hearing any of it. They're all quiet. You know, I'm sure the American people are so happy to see that one of Joe Biden's first accomplishments in office has been to bomb Syria. Americans, the very same Americans who have yet to see any of those relief checks they were promised, which were originally $2,000, now reduced to $1,400. The same Americans who were told they can't have a minimum wage, a $15 minimum wage through budget reconciliation, even though Biden said it would be a top priority and made it one of the pillars of his campaign. The same Americans who were told no more kids in cages, which also turned out to be a lie. The kids are no longer separated from their parents, perhaps, but they're still locked up in nicer looking cages with air conditioners. The same Americans that were told the erratic Donald Trump would be defeated and replaced with Biden, who would restore the soul of the nation and dignity to the White House. It seems Americans were told a lot of things, a lot of nice things. And not just by Biden's campaign, but even by intellectuals and scholars that claimed he would be less dangerous than Trump. Well, as far as Syria is concerned, that's nonsense. But it's okay though, because remember, at least now there's diversity. Remember, you were promised diversity and unity by the Biden administration. So now you have Lloyd Austin, the first black man to lead the Pentagon, who also happens to be a former board member for Raytheon, the weapons manufacturer. Or the fact that Kamala Harris is the first Asian American and female vice president. Or Avril Haines, the first woman to be director of national intelligence. Now that makes everything okay. Just put a bunch of rainbows on the bombs and everything will be okay, right? Of course, the neocons and proponents of the war on terror will tell you that Biden does have the right to do military strikes on other nations under the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, the AUMF, which was signed into law in 2001 and 2002, giving a carte blanche, a blank check for the Bush administration and every administration since to invade other countries, order drone strikes and assassinations, and run wild with any foreign policy decision they please. Many have rightfully criticized the AUMF and have called it unconstitutional for the sweeping powers that it gives the commander-in-chief, who can effectively bypass Congress and go behind its back to attack other countries. But even if the entire US Congress had okayed this imperialist attack on Syria, that would still not make it okay. The US Congress is not the world police. Its decrees are not universal and absolute. Biden's airstrikes on Syria are first and foremost a violation of international law. The United States has no right to attack a sovereign nation and another member of the United Nations. This clearly violates the United Nations Charter, specifically Article 2.4, which says that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. But of course, it's not about laws, it's about language, it's about PR. So under Trump, the kids in cages, that's called concentration camps. But under Biden, they're migrant overflow facilities. And when Trump bombs Syria, they decry him as a mad king. But when Biden does, they're defensive airstrikes. You know, let's just go ahead and remove the word imperialism from the dictionary. Let's replace it with Biden's unity slogan instead, shall we? So while Biden's administration claims it's more diverse, let's be frank with each other here. There's no diversity in terms of policy. You know, he can paint as many transgender flags and put as many Black Lives Matter decals on the bombs as he wants. But these are the same imperialist tactics, the same imperialist agenda used by every president before him. This is just a furthering of America's imperialist interests and its neocon behavior, which the US has been carrying out in the Middle East for the past decades, crippling Syria, crippling Syria's allies, being hawks on Iran, continuing to occupy Iraq illegally. That's what it comes down to, and there's no difference there. So to claim diversity, this means absolutely nothing for the people who are under those bombs when they fall. As a matter of fact, it means nothing for Americans, who are also being given the short end of the stick and robbed of their own wealth so that the military-industrial complex, the weapons manufacturers, and private corporations can make tons of money and build swimming pools for themselves while they starve. That's what it comes down to. There's no diversity there. But in moments like these, I think it's very important to look back at history, right? Damascus, the capital of Syria, where I was born, is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It's thousands of years old. Many civilizations, many empires have tried to capture Syria. Many foreign invaders and their armies have tried to take the Middle East and claim Syria as their own. But none of them last forever. Look around Syria and you will find nothing but the ruins of those very empires who thought they would last forever. As history shows us, every dog has their day. Every empire rises and every empire falls. But Syria always remains. Insha'Allah. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is The Communiqué.